Hello and welcome to Hauger History Podcast number 116. We're going to talk about the 1980s, so I'm wearing my Nintendo shirt. Nintendo started in 1985, one of the best-loved consoles of all time among video gamers. And today we're going to talk about Ronald Reagan, who among Republicans is one of the greatest presidents of all time from their political spectrum, and someone who was admired by many people on both sides of the aisle as well. And we'll discuss why, what his economic policies were, what his social policies were, what some of the effects were, and how it changed United States history. So this should be cool. If you're on distance learning, I hope you'll enjoy this. This is an option for you to get away from the book. You're welcome to still read the book and encouraged to do so, but this will give you a rundown of all the key points that we would have gone over in class. So let's take a look. I find that in government class, when I taught seniors, this was a really good chance to talk about the difference between liberals and conservatives. Before we do, I'll tell you that not one person, probably in the United States, conforms to all policies of their own particular party and has been touched by multiple issues individually and maybe chooses. But these are going to be overgeneralized. I just want to let you know this doesn't make up every person's definition of what a liberal or conservative is. These are the definitions from your textbook. Let's fill in this chart. Generally, that if you are a liberal, you believe that the federal government has an obligation to monitor businesses and indeed monitor for the social welfare of all citizens. You also are likely to believe that the federal government has a responsibility to care for the needs of its citizens. If you are a conservative, you're more likely to believe that a small national government is best, that states should have most of the power within their local and state governments to take care of citizens, and the national government should be smaller and concern itself primarily with international affairs and matters of national security, and want that body of government to be smaller. Now, if you go on a web search, you will find all sorts of wacky bias stuff. I went through 12 images that were either all pro-liberal or all pro-conservative and present similar charts to this, but are painting one side to be heroes and one side to be villains. I'll say watch out for that. This one I found was close to as respectable, that basically outlines a few more things. That liberals often believe that business should be regulated for protection of citizens and that there should be spending on social programs, where conservatives are more likely to believe in deregulation for purer markets that have less obstacles and admire more spending for defense than for social programs. And that is going to put exemplar presidents Ronald Reagan on the right for the conservative parties and FDR for the liberals as an exemplar of what these values are and what they stand for. But definitely look out for biased information whenever you're researching this topic. But certainly search out materials and look to widen your influence. So today you'll be taking a page of bulleted notes as we explore this President Ronald Reagan and explore how he impacted the nation. And even though I can't be with you, this is a great time to go over some really interesting materials. Here is a cool quote that Ronald Reagan had running for president in 1980. He said, "A recession is when your neighbor loses his job. A depression is when you lose yours, and recovery is when Jimmy Carter loses his." What's really interesting about Reagan, he's known as the great communicator. He was a former sports broadcaster. He was the governor of California. He was a movie star. The dude knows how to speak. And as someone who has a radio broadcasting background, it's really interesting for me to explore how skilled an orator, meaning speaker or communicator, this guy was. So I went ahead and actually looked up a top 10 list of some of his famous and most well-known quotes. And if you don't mind, I would love to take a look at that with you here. So let's just look at a few. Peace is not absence of conflict. It's the ability to handle conflict by peaceful means. A lot of these we could pause and really explore what they mean. It would be a great analysis. In fact, I would offer extra credit, a couple of points if you wanted to go and analyze 4 or 5 of these on a document and send them to me and what you think they mean, whether or not you think they are profound. This one says, "A people free to choose will always choose peace." And now, so that resonates with a lot of people. "Trust but verify" is a famous Reagan quote that others have used and that modern politicians will often use and recall back to him as well. "While I take inspiration from the past, like most Americans, I live for the future," meaning we are moving forward. "Concentrated power has always been the enemy of liberty. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted, it belongs to the brave. There are no constraints on the human mind, no walls around the human spirit, no barriers to our progress except those we ourselves erect. So don't stand in the way of progress. Within the covers of the Bible are the answers to the problems men face. Number 2, there are no great limits to growth because there are no limits of human intelligence, imagination, and wonder. And number 1, Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. So I think those are all pretty good. And just about every president can have a list of some really impressive quotes, but Reagan seemed a cut above with his quips, with his wit, with his fast thinking, especially through his early presidential years as he was one of the older presidents. And just his ability to reach the American people and speak to people in a way that was very convincing. So let's talk about Ronald Reagan's economic policies. If you're taking bulleted notes, let's make an economy section and make a social section. Maybe you do a T-chart if you'd like to stay organized. So Ronald Reagan came into office promising to change government since he had won the support of voters who resented the federal government for overtaxing and wasting tax funds. He pledged to get the government off their backs and said that government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. So that was a manner of speaking in which other presidents have modeled in the recent years as well. That promise of change or reshaping government into a more efficient shape. And he sought, as part of his assault on big government and seeking the conservative values of a smaller influence, he expanded Nixon's new federalism policy. Like Nixon, Reagan wanted to shift power from the federal government to the states. But Nixon had used revenue sharing. Reagan delegated responsibility to the states themselves to manage their funds, issues, problems, and solutions. He helped states fund these social programs by issuing block grants that the treasuries could use freely as they wished to solve their own problems and allocate resources to suit their individual needs instead of telling them what the money had to be used for. He also believed in supply-side economics. According to the law of supply and demand, inflation occurs when demand exceeds supply. It often occurs in times of low unemployment, and when more workers are purchasing goods and services, thereby prices become raised. As President Reagan faced both inflation and high unemployment, partly the results of soaring oil prices. And then today, as I record this, oil prices dropped 300%. So it'll be interesting to see how the market responds to that in the current day, going back and looking at the 80s again. To address these issues, he promised to stimulate the economy by cutting taxes. That's something we've done in the last couple of years. And promoting private enterprise. That was soon called Reaganomics. Much of his plan was based on a theory called supply-side economics, which states that economic growth depends on increasing the supply of goods and services. The way to increase supply is to cut taxes. Lower tax rates will leave more money in the hands of individuals and businesses, providing an incentive for them to save and invest. Individuals will work harder, in theory, save more, and spend more. In turn, companies can then hire more workers, and the gains that are given to the top will trickle down to the bottom. So that's sometimes called trickle-down economics as well. Critics say that that's voodoo economics, and it's unrealistic to believe that lowering tax rates would increase revenue. This approach created 18.4 million new jobs, and economics still debate the impact of tax cuts on the resurgence, but many do agree that increased defense spending was an important factor. Military spending pumped billions of dollars into the economy. The recovery didn't benefit everyone equally. Although personal incomes grew in every stratum, the income gap between rich and poor widened considerably during the 1980s. Because incomes of the wealthy increased significantly more, liberals argued that Reaganomics helped the rich and did not help the poor in the same ratio. But people who support the policy will note that everyone's income did go up, but they didn't go up to the same extent. So it's kind of an interesting conversation to analyze. Another thing that Reagan called for in the economy was deregulation. He wanted to see the removal of controls on business and the removal of barriers from government that would help limit the power. And he believed that would allow businesses to run more efficiently, to generate more profits because they would have less red tape. And that profit would be transferable to consumers who could then benefit from lower prices because he would be able to make goods and services for less money. Under President Carter in the 1970s, Congress had eased restrictions on the railroad, airline, and trucking industries. Reagan believed further deregulation would also help other kinds of business activity and boost the economy overall. Some deregulation efforts focused on eliminating laws to curb pollution and ensure safety in the workplace because many companies believed they were a costly obstacle. A Reagan deregulation task force delayed and obstructed regulation of companies handling hazardous waste, as well as rules against exposing workers to toxins. Per Reagan's guidelines, the EPA began to lower federal standards of air and water quality. There were also the issue of our national debt and annual deficits. They soared during these two terms in office. A budget deficit occurs when government spending is more than what the government makes in revenue. U.S. budget deficits remained below $75 million before Reagan, but from 1982 to the end of his second term, annual deficits exceeded $100 billion per year. In 1986, the annual deficit reached $221 billion. These expanding deficits were partly due to Reagan's tax cuts, because that decreased the amount of money that the government was making. Another contributing factor was increasing military spending. The Department of Defense's annual budget increased nearly 85% in Reagan's first term. Budget deficits also grew when the rising costs of Social Security and Medicare. Federal budget deficits caused the national debt to skyrocket. It nearly tripled from $900 billion in 1980 to $2.6 trillion in 1988. The sum was far greater than the accumulated debt of all U.S. presidents combined before him. The government was forced to borrow hundreds of billions of dollars to pay the debt's interest, and now we're at a spot where we're over $23 trillion in debt in 2020. You can take a look at this chart, and you can see how the debt really began to increase from 82 to the end of Reagan's second term, and how our national debt has always been increasing for decades and decades now, extending back to 1970s as the time where we really started to see a rise overall. Social welfare. So let's talk about social policies. We'll move over to the other side of your T-chart for a few minutes. Feel free to pause and replay anything you need. Social welfare spending was reduced. That includes cuts to food stamps, federal aid for the elderly, for the poor, and the disabled. There were also cuts to helping low-income families pay rent. Liberals protested that these cuts forced cities to reduce services to the people who were in need, and that harmed the poor. Cuts severely affected women with young children, as well as young adults with few job skills and who hadn't had a lot of education training. The number of children who lived in poverty grew by 25% during the 80s, and the amount of homeless people also increased dramatically. HIV and AIDS also began to emerge, and people who were in lower income began to be more affected, and that became true of people with other illnesses as well. There were also social movements to promote family values and to say no to drugs, which was a popular campaign or a widely spread campaign that was headlined and headed up, let's say, by Nancy Reagan, who led an urge from youths to say no to drugs. I remember going to play video games at the arcade early on, and even getting Nintendo games that would have say no to drugs ads on some of them while the screens were rotating. So there was an increased education campaign for working against drugs. There were cut to entitlement programs. There was also a new coalition of conservative think tanks and periodicals to help develop policies that would boost patriotism, family values, and business, and the goals of creating smaller government. And there were also a revival of TV and radio programs that would support these ideals. There's a picture of Reagan on the set and a picture of the president in the Oval Office. Reagan ran on conservative issues, and his economic policies are still going to be quoted in many elections to come as a time period where statistical gains in jobs and economic growth were big pros, and of critics who will say that national debt and inequalities began to peak as well. Reagan asked scientists for strategic defense initiatives, new anti-missile defense systems, a lot of new defense spending and defense budgets, interceptor missiles, tracking systems, laser-guided weaponry. These were all developed in a big way during this time, called Star Wars, one of the initiatives. And there was a recession and recovery. This helped consumer spending fuel an upturn in the economy. And spending outstripped revenues. New taxes didn't balance the budget, so we also had an increase in debt. On some other things that happened during this time period, though, Reagan appointed Sandra Day O'Connor as the first woman justice on the Supreme Court. He appointed Clarence Thomas, and the court became more conservative. And there's a picture of Sandra Day O'Connor and her first term in her first court of justices. He did make cuts to the EPA, as we talked about, and he got a lot of diverse groups together, and he expanded the amount of conservatives in the nation as well. And there you go. That gets us all the way to President George H.W. Bush, and we're going to save that for another day. What a good topic and what a good conversation we've had. I hope that you've enjoyed it, and feel free to submit those notes by email. Until next time, the 80s are almost over, but we will certainly talk about more issues as we get into the next episode. Until then, everybody, have a great day. Talk to you soon. Class is dismissed.